I'd like to welcome everyone to our roundtable on what is music if not traditional, revisiting and reflecting on notions of tradition. I'm going to introduce the panel in reverse order in very minute introductions. Then we each have very brief statements, certainly brief when compared with academic papers, because we would like this to largely be a roundtable and discussion and throw the question out to everyone about what we mean by traditional music or musical traditions. So starting with the person who will speak, who will tie things up as the final speaker, Dr. Dylan Robinson is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University, and his current research focuses on Indigenous art, including sound art, in public spaces. Sherry Johnson is Associate Professor of Music at York University. She does research on fiddling and step dancing traditions, there's that word, in Ontario. I'm Margaret Walker. I'm an Associate Professor of Ethno/Musicology at Queen's University. My research projects include Indo-Canadian dance, transitions to colonialism in India, and musical communities in Kingston. The question of problematizing the term traditional seems by now quite old news. Certainly we're all as familiar with invented traditions as we are with imagined communities, and many of us probably feel comfortably blasé deconstructing claims of cultural purity, ancient roots, and unchanging oral practices. Most of us are also probably comfortable with a definition of tradition, including traditional music, that includes notions of communal value, no matter how small or how imagined the community, group identity, perhaps geographical relevance, although traditions can and do migrate, perhaps the idea of a functional role, and probably some notion of heritage, stewardship, and responsibility. What Dorothy Noyes calls at the end of her article, describes at the end of her article as hand-to-hand transfer. But many of these are characteristics of so-called folk music as well, and some are arguably characteristic of all music. Yet to argue that all music is thus traditional makes the phrase traditional music a tautology, as redundant as chai tea, one of my favorite, or gamelan orchestra. Most often, it seems, however, people use the phrase to communicate a largely unexamined contrast between traditional and non-traditional musics. The stereotypical binary for tradition is, of course, modernity. But in terms of music, non-traditional music can be popular music of any genre, certainly avant-garde or electronic music and things like sound installations, and curiously enough, classical music. And it's this last that I'm going to focus on, as my background is in Western classical music, and much of my research has been in Indian classical dance, and by extension, Indian classical music. Kathak, the classical dance of North India, is a virtuosic theatrical genre performed by trained professionals on stage in large theaters or concert halls. It's a 20th century dance that took its present form during the decades of the cultural revival that led up to Indian independence in 1947. One reads and hears much of the time that Kathak is an ancient dance with Hindu devotional origins, but this dominant discourse is also characteristic of the 20th century revival and its Orientalist framework. The term traditional, when used to describe Kathak, sometimes refers to these imagined ancient origins, but more often refers to the dance's solo form, which took shape in the 1950s. The traditional Kathak solo comprises a series of juxtaposed dance items, some improvised and some pre-composed, that are drawn from a variety of origins. It's commonly contrasted with group choreographies, which are new creations and explore current themes and issues almost as often as they illustrate historical or mythological stories. Traditional Kathak is also seen as opposed to contemporary Kathak, although some practitioners would prefer that their creative work be called contemporary Indian dance, without any overt connection to any of the classical dances. This, of course, equates traditional with classical, and I have heard dancers use the terms interchangeably when talking about the solo form and its standard repertoire. So just for a comparison, actually at this very moment as I was typing, I went into Firefox and I Googled traditional Indian dance, traditional Canadian dance, traditional European dance, and traditional Indigenous dance. The sites that appeared as traditional Indian dance were about the 6 classical dance genres. The Canadian and European searches resulted in sites about folk dance, and the Indigenous search brought up powwow dances. Now, although I argue Kathak is not an ancient temple dance, it is certainly not a folk dance by any stretch of the imagination. Indeed, as a classical dance, it might be compared more accurately with ballet than square dancing. Yet in the Indo-Canadian diaspora, classical dances like Kathak can serve as markers of Indian identity performed at multicultural music festivals and community celebrations, much as the so-called folk traditions do in other hyphenated Canadian contexts. This is often to the chagrin of professional Kathak or Bharatanatyam dancers who see the use of dance classes as lessons in Indian cultural identity rather than serious artistic training as a marginalization of their artistry. Furthermore, Indo-Canadian dancers who combine professional excellence in their dance's traditional practices with contemporary themes, fusions, and other explorations, as many of their contemporaries in India do, can face criticisms from Canadian audiences of all varieties for watering down the art form and not being authentic enough. So what am I getting at here? If Kathak as a classical dance is also a traditional dance, then should not ballet and modern be considered traditional dances too? Joanne Kiali Inohomoko argued back around 1970 that ballet should be considered an ethnic dance, as it, like all music and dance, reflects the cultural traditions, there's that word again, within which it developed. Yet, although I've been reassured a number of times that my field of study is acceptable fodder for CSTM, I would nevertheless hesitate before submitting a paper that was purely about Kathak, just as I would certainly hesitate about submitting an abstract that was about ballet, Western art music, or Oriental dance, in big square quotes, all topics which are of interest to me, but somehow don't feel like they are traditional enough. My brief look at the use of the modifier traditional as applied to Kathak and other Indian classical dance shows it to be, in some ways, the opposite of its use in Euro-American contexts. This changes somewhat in the Canadian diasporic context, but in doing so seems to impose creative straitjackets on professional artists. I therefore invite some critical discussion about the inclusion or exclusion of classical or art music and dance in the category of traditional.
So some of these papers have changed substantially since we first read them. So there may be a little more overlap or not than we had intended. In any case, last year I was assigned to teach a colleague's grad course entitled Tradition and Revival in British and Canadian Folk Music. I tried to decline, arguing that the concepts of revival and particularly tradition were overstudied and didn't seem to me to offer anything new to today's graduate students in ethnomusicology. And my suspicions seemed to be confirmed when I found very little recent theorizing about tradition in the literature of ethnomusicology and other related disciplines. There were numerous recent studies about particular traditions, for example, the musical traditions of, and then you can name your country or your region or whatever, or the process of tradition, as in traditionalization of women's songs in Uganda or whatever, but nothing really that moved the conversation beyond the theoretical literature of the early 2000s, which I had used as the basis of my dissertation. I concluded that the idea of tradition had taken us as far as it could in terms of understanding social and cultural phenomena, and that ethnomusicology was moving in other directions. When I wasn't able to get out of teaching this course so easily, I decided to interrogate the history and development of the concepts of tradition and revival and their relative authenticity through the disciplines of folklore, anthropology, and ethnomusicology. And I reasoned that even if the concepts themselves were not particularly relevant anymore, surely the process of scholarly interrogation would be. And while the process was appreciated by the majority of students, I was surprised at how many of them got excited about the concepts themselves, and in fact went on to use them as the basis for their own work. Many of them were coming into contact for the first time with the idea that tradition, regardless really of the years of theorizing in academia and successions of scholarly definitions, is used by people, musicians, in their everyday lives in a myriad of different ways, often contradictory ways, and used strategically for particular purposes. And if people and musicians are using this term in their everyday lives to promote their music, to get gigs, to attract audiences, to position themselves in winning awards, then I think it's a concept that will probably always have some currency in the work that we do. But still, I wondered why there had been no recent theorizing. Carleton University historian Mark Phillips asked the same question in 2004 in his introduction to a multidisciplinary collection of essays called Questions of Tradition. And this is the most recent body of work with which I am familiar that really attempts to trace meanings of the term across disciplines through time and interrogate what those different kinds of meanings mean. Unfortunately, there's no chapter written from the perspective of ethnomusicology or any of the performing arts, but there's chapters from literature, philosophy, psychology, the hard sciences, history, of course, and social sciences. So in preparing my contribution for this panel, I went back to the collection, which had come out in the final stages of my dissertation, and I would like to revisit briefly an idea that had greatly appealed to me at the time, but which I chose to let go in the interest of ever finishing my dissertation, and that is the relationship between tradition and modernity. As Margaret has already pointed out, the main tendency in tradition scholarship is to construct it as a binary opposite to modernity. Mark Phillips, however, urges scholars to consider the two as part of the same process, of modernity as tradition and vice versa. And so I begin this brief discussion with the quote that ended my dissertation in 2006. According to Phillips, one effect of an enlarged conversation about tradition should be, quote, to dissolve the simple binary of tradition and modernity, which for so long has distracted those who have tried to come to grips with the concept. Once this false opposition is set aside and the problem of tradition ceases to be defined as a resistance to modernity, tradition again becomes a means of raising essential questions about the ways in which we pass on the life of cultures. Questions that necessarily include issues of authority as well as invention, practice as well as interpretation, end quote. That this is so made a lot of sense to me. It immediately felt right. But I couldn't figure out what this new conceptualization of tradition would look like in practice, in my writing. What would it look like, for example, to analyze the practice of Ontario contest fiddlers using an understanding of tradition that was not set up in direct opposition to modernity, as it's used time and time and time again throughout the community? I quickly realized that even though we still often use tradition and modernity as binary opposites in the way we write, our ethnographic descriptions and interpretations are much richer and more complex, yielding examples that demonstrate the fluidity of past and present, continuity and change, as musicians construct their identities and their practices in real life. For example, from my research with Ontario fiddlers, I concluded that many of these fiddlers live a fluid and continually constructed tradition, whether or not they're consciously aware of that. A particular 3-minute performance on a stage in a small town, Ontario, may reveal a waltz that was written by the performer last week, paired with a jig that was composed 300 years ago in Scotland, and a reel imported from Cape Breton, but with obvious Cape Breton styling markers removed. The fiddler plays with the bounce and drive required to inspire a room full of dancers, and yet she stands still in front of a microphone and plays for an audience of listeners and 2 or 3 judges in particular. The fiddle may be 100 years old, commissioned in the last few years, or passed down through generations. Strings will be top-notch, and the instrument will be in excellent repair, so the tone is rich and strong. Some aspects of that performance will change when the musicians move out into the campground and jam the night away. Other aspects will not. Ontario contest fiddlers, and most musicians, I assume, are quite adept at balancing change and continuity, of referencing the past in a variety of ways, sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically, and sometimes as strategic rejection. They do not conceive of their lives as encompassing an opposition between tradition and modernity. They are merely two facets of the same identity, which enable them to successfully meet their goals. In his contribution to questions of tradition, James Clifford writes that, quote, loyalty to the past, often understood as tradition, is in practice a way ahead, a distinct path in the present, end quote. So is rejection of the past, and picking and choosing which aspects of the past make sense in particular times and places and for particular purposes. Tradition is not the past, but the way we construct our culture, our practice, ourselves in relation to the past. And according to Gadamer, tradition is a structure then of understanding, a way of being in the world. And so how individuals and communities conceive of tradition is important. How do different participants define it? How do communities decide who has the power to define it? Who is included and excluded in each of these definitions? How do disenfranchised communities deal with definitions that have been imposed upon them? How do definitions change over time according to particular contexts? These kinds of questions provide some tools that may help us to better understand the critical role of relationships and identity in processes of cultural transmission, construction, and transformation. And so I'm excited about returning to tradition and exploring if and how tradition as a, quote, newly complex, open-ended subject, as Clifford calls it, when the tradition-modernity binary is dismantled, can yield new insights or new depth and complexity to my research. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to address that a little bit in the conversation that follows. So on to Dylan.
Hey, Swale. I am going to pick up, in a way, from all of the papers, but particularly Sherry's discussion of modernity, because as a newcomer to CSTM, I'm fascinated and also a little anxious about participating in dialogues on tradition. So I'm going to focus mostly on an area that I work in, on Indigenous modernity. So I'd like to continue the conversation today by focusing on this concept of Indigenous modernity, a phrase that has increasingly been used to describe the post-contact Western impact of settler colonial culture upon Indigenous peoples. Indigenous modernity lays out one of many subaltern histories of modernity that, according to scholar Dilip Gaunkar, says, quote, these have arrived not suddenly but slowly, awakened by contact, transported through commerce, administered by empires, bearing colonial inscriptions, propelled by nationalism, and now steered by global media, migration, and capital. And it continues to emerge and arrive, as always, in opportunistic fragments accompanied by utopian rhetorics, but no longer from the West alone, end quote. And I'd like to go on to say, and never from the West alone. Sort of there's a longer, we can think about modernity, as I'll discuss a little bit later on, as a process that has happened for well before contact. Just as these subaltern modernities have operated along positive and negative axes, so too must we acknowledge Indigenous modernity's deleterious impacts on Indigenous peoples alongside the innovations spawned by contact with other peoples, technologies, and traditions. Following this line of argument, in Canada, the impact of colonial institutions such as residential schools and government policy, such as the Indian Act, that serves to impoverish Indigenous communities, these sit alongside the survivance and vitality of contemporary Indigenous traditions. In contrast to the binary framework of what Dilip Gaunkar calls the good and bad modernities, in ethnomusicological research, the term Indigenous modernity seems to have been used fairly consistently to name a positive alternative modernity comprised of contemporary Indigenous musical genres. While it is important to acknowledge and affirm the current vitality of contemporary Indigenous music, I also wonder why we have avoided naming the more negative context surrounding musics of Indigenous modernity. And perhaps this question also applies to other subaltern or alternative musical modernities, which we can discuss later if it's of interest to people in the room here today. These questions have been on my mind as I've co-edited a collection on Indigenous modernity in music with Dr. Vicky Levine over the past couple of years. During this process of writing, workshopping, and editing, one thing has become quite clear. While the phrase Indigenous modernity, when the phrase Indigenous modernity is used, it is used primarily for the function of aesthetically categorizing contemporary Indigenous practices as other than traditional. Indigenous modernity here is used to refer to contemporary categories of music making, including rap, hip-hop, or classical music, yet it is not often used to mark the ontological or epistemological distinctions between Indigenous musical practices, that other binary identified by Kofi Agawu in African music making as being either functional or aesthetic, that is, for music that serves a function in ritual, or music that is for contemplation or reflection. In its most common usage, then, Indigenous modernity in relation with music signals the stylistic change between those of our historical cultural practices called traditional, supposedly not of modernity, and forms of contemporary music making. For these reasons, the phrase has sometimes sat uncomfortably with me as an unintentionally patronizing appeal to recognize contemporary practices as being of equal importance to the historical or traditional. In this sense, I wonder whether the use of the phrase Indigenous modernity to legitimize contemporary Indigenous art practices may at times, against intention, instead reinforce binaries of tradition and modernity. To counter the politics of recognition this statement evokes, I'd suggest we might examine this thing called Indigenous modernity not merely as a fixed temporal or aesthetic category, but an ongoing process. A process of relation and negotiation that extends back beyond Western contact to Indigenous origin stories. As the inverse of Bruno Latour's oft-cited dictum, we have never been modern. I'm jumping ahead here now. That's where I'm going. Indigenous peoples and our musics have always been modern. In this light, modernity as a process rather than a period or style may be seen to operate whenever encounters between Indigenous peoples and newcomers have taken place, and also those encounters that predate the era of Western contact. That is, modernity, the sort of response to this process of modernity takes place when our nations, Indigenous nations, have contact with each other historically as well. In examining Indigenous musical modernities like other musical modernities, I'd like to assert the need to go well beyond merely describing the contemporary aesthetics of Indigenous cultural practices and question how the ontologies of Indigenous song continue to be articulated, renegotiated, and transformed in contemporary artistic practices. In considering Indigenous ontologies, it becomes necessary to examine the ways in which Indigenous songs and oration do things beyond an aesthetic function as songs and semantic function of speech, and consider their efficacy in non-Indigenous presentation contexts. Indigenous music, both traditional and modern in this sense, might be understood as song acts, following J.L. Austin's theory of speech acts that do what they say. To what extent does contemporary Indigenous music, whether we categorize it as part of Indigenous modernity or not, continue the work that our songs do in ceremonial contexts, communicating with ancestors, honoring our families, and affirming sovereign rights? The genres of Indigenous modernity allow Indigenous peoples to speak of contemporary Indigenous experience in contemporary artistic forms. Indigenous hip-hop, rap, opera, classical, country, or noise music assert the vibrancy of our cultures on a continuum with tradition rather than a break from it. The contemporary genres such as these carry our cultural knowledge into the present, as do our potlatch songs, throat singing, or Cree hunting songs. As scholars who study contemporary Indigenous musical genres, we may now be more able to recognize this continuum of cultural practice rather than categorize new genres as subsidiary to older expressions of Indigenous tradition. Yet it is equally important to recognize the ways in which contemporary Indigenous song is on a continuum not only with the aesthetics of cultural practice, but with the ontologies of doing that our traditions enact. What would it mean, for example, to understand the function of contemporary Indigenous song not as aesthetic, but as doing something or bringing something into being through their performance or utterance, as Austin says of speech acts? Recognizing this is to reframe our ontological understanding of contemporary Indigenous music. When does Musqueam hip-hop, for example, not merely narrate our connection to the land, but instead act as a land claim? When does Mohawk classical music not firstly present history in musical form, but serve as primary historical documentation, as precisely and rigorously as we consider our written research would do? And when does Stalo rap not merely describe reconciliation, but enact treaty? Importantly, these are not merely the questions I pose for the purpose of this roundtable, but also the questions First Peoples must now address within our own communities as we continue to innovate practices of what I call sensate sovereignty. Appeals to uphold Indigenous sovereign rights are appeals for political recognition in the eyes of the state. Forms of political sovereignty argued for upon the terms of the state in many ways run counter to those practiced forms of sensate sovereignty, that is, forms of doing in Indigenous cultural traditions, including, for example, the materiality of wampum belt exchange or the singing of land rights. I can get into those examples a little bit further if there's clarification needed. It's good to remember the teachings of our ancestors and traditions. Remembering here is not a form of nostalgia, but rather an action of making our traditions present across a range of contemporary forms. By doing so, we also continue the ontological instrumentality of our traditions and their power to do things in the world. Thank you.